Bertrand Russell was a famous British philosopher, and he said that there is a teapot orbiting the sun, somewhere between the Earth and Mars. And if you don't believe it, it's your job to prove me wrong. But the point he was making was that, of course, that's ridiculous. That if you come up with a theory about something that is incredible, it's your job to prove that the theory is correct. It's not really my job to prove that it's not correct. And in my journey through viruses that started with HIV, and in 1999, I looked at West Nile virus, and then somebody said, you should look at polio, and I said, I don't want to look at polio, but I did, and then somebody said mad cow disease, which is not a virus but a prion, and foot and mouth disease, and the 1914 influenza. As I went through them, I started to see patterns of bad science being repeated. And so today, I can't prove that all viruses don't exist. That might be my thought, but given that we're in the position where we shouldn't have to prove that a viral theory is wrong, but that's the position we find ourselves in, I'm taking two examples of infectious theories, and I'm going to critically examine them today, and I'm sure at least one of them you've never heard of before. So if we can go to the next slide. So I'm just asking the question, if no viruses exist, how should we be examining a viral theory to try to see if it's true or not? And next. So there's like 3,000 viruses. You know, if we do this all 3,000 at a time, it's going to take us the rest of time. So I'm going to look at the Milan plague of 1629 to 1632, and I'll tell you why I chose that, and polio. So you might say, well, the Milan plague, that was Yersinia pestis, the plague bacteria. It wasn't virus at all. But the question is, was it infectious? That's really the question I'm asking. If we say it might be infectious, then we can ask, what was it? And I think you'd have, at this amount of time later, you'd have a really hard time saying it was a bacteria or a virus, given that there's no physical specimens left. So how do we know that a historical epidemic, so we got 1629 and we've got 1950s, the big polio epidemic in the United States. How do we know it was infectious or not? I assumed for many years that polio was very simple. There was an epidemic, there was a vaccine, polio disappeared, case closed. And most people assume that. But we will see that that's far from the truth. Next. So with ancient epidemics, we could look at oral history. We could look at archaeological evidence. For example, in the 1918 flu, they managed to exhume one body in Alaska, and they found a PCR of influenza virus in the lungs, and they said, okay, well that proves that everybody who died in 1918 died of the influenza epidemic. The reality is you don't have very much of that evidence. It's not like they had 1,000 bodies that they analyzed and all of them came up with the same strain of the flu. They had one, maybe two bodies. So a written report would be the best way. And miraculously, in the 1629 to 1632 epidemic in Milan, there was a 1640 report written in Latin, and I don't read Latin, and a 1648 report in Italian, and I do read Italian. And also, how I discovered this was, there was an 1827 book called I Promessi Sposi, which is the betrothed couple, which is kind of a sappy love story about, at the beginning, they fall in love, at the end, they get married, and in between, shit happens. And one of the things that happens is that the boy, I mean, they were probably 14, given that this was a 1800s book. He ends up in Milan at the time of the epidemic. And Manzoni, the novelist, actually gives a pretty faithful rendition based on the 1648 report. So next. So here's the 1648 report is now online, like everything else in the world. And what it says in English on this cover page, report on the origin and timeline of the Grand Plague, contagious, poisonous, and evil, in the city and state of Milan, 1629 to 32. The two parts are from the beginning of time until the birth of Jesus, and then from the birth of Jesus till the present day, which of course would be the 1630s. And it also includes a list of helpful antidotes, which we will look at later. And it's written by Alessandro Tadino, who was a physician. And that's important because a physician wrote this. There were many players in this epidemic, but the one who wrote the report was a physician. And also he was supported by members of the illustrious Health Committee of the State of Milan, 1648. Next. So how do we know it was an infectious epidemic? Because Tadino said it was infectious. It's interesting that in this book you can find many words that are still in use today. Contagion, quarantine, which means 40 days in Italian. Could he see the pathogen? We'll see later that he most definitely could not see the pathogen. He actually admitted he couldn't see it. Did he have any kinds of tests? Did he have antibody tests or PCR? Obviously not. So let's look at some of the other things he said. And if in this report he says all kinds of crazy, irrational things, then you really have to question, like, how can we accept that it is an infectious epidemic when everything else he says is obviously crazy? Like, if that's what we find, then you might question the conclusion that it was an infectious epidemic. So he talked about antidotes, he talked about causes, and he talked about preventives, and we'll go into those later. So here's an example. This is a powerful story that sort of encapsulates the general infectious theory. A young woman, apron, infected house. The apron obviously was infected with something. And from this, 732 people died. But he goes on to say that the saints, Sebastian and Rocco, intervened. And the locals who were devoted to those saints were therefore liberated from the contagion. So I think you can see that this is not total rationality coming out of this doctrine. It's a mixture of his theory that there is this invisible contagion that can multiply, and that one invisible agent can become 732 invisible agents and can kill that many people. But then we get the saints involved. Next. One thing I'll talk about later is there were some different personalities involved. But this is a scientific experiment. So first of all, they found some people called the Untioni, who were evil people who spread this invisible poison on walls. They painted it on walls because they were evil and they wanted to kill everybody. And so they killed these delinquents, the people who'd been spreading this invisible poison on the walls. And then they took some of this invisible poison, which actually wasn't totally invisible because they said it was a dark yellow color, and they put it on a piece of bread, and they fed it to some hens and some other animals, and half an hour later, they were all dead, and when they cut them open, they were black inside. This is an early example of a rigorous scientific experiment. Okay, so, as promised, antidoti contra la peste, antidotes against the plague. So we have children's urine, lye, certain stones, wine, chicken shit, burning certain leaves at night, laurel leaves. You take the human feces and take the water off, and you could use that. Another thing they like to do is if you had ulcers on your legs, a lot of plagues involved serious skin conditions, that they would take a hot iron and they'd burn your legs. It's called a cautery. Toxic metals, antimony, arsenic, and of course holy candles. Very effective against the plague.
That's all against.
Yes.
It's not in favor.
Yes, so he also included a very helpful, accurate historical list of plagues that went back to the beginning of time. And they used a different timing system back then, so they didn't use BC, so I'm not exactly sure when he thought the beginning of time was, but it was about 6,000 years before the present, maybe plus or minus. And he documented the causes without indicating any skepticism as to whether these were the real causes or not. So if we go to the next. So eclipses were a big cause of all kinds of things. The wind, air pollution caused by fog. Well, that actually might have been a cause. People back in the 1600s, I mean in the Roman times, were processing metals like lead and other toxic compounds. So a fog, when you had people smelting metals, could have actually been quite toxic. But their idea was not that it was a toxin in terms of a chemical, but that there was some mysterious agent in there. Fumes from dead bodies, cold winters. Of course, wicked women, that's always a good one, and Jews. I've got to include those. So there were all kinds of different causes to the previous epidemics, and my favorite is dying dragons.
My favorite is wicked women.
Yes. Yeah, if you read my favorite books, children's books are the Narnia Chronicles, and there's a lot of wicked women in the Narnia Chronicles. Like every woman, apart from the heroines in that book, is a witch, the White Witch, whatever. There's the poisoned sewing needles, which is kind of reminiscent of the story of, what's that fairy tale?
Hands on
Yeah. Anyway, so moving on. So some of the preventives, as I said, quaranta is 40 in Italian, so quarantine is an Italian word that means 40 days. And I really believe that this came from the Bible, as you probably remember if you were growing up Christian, that Jesus went into the desert for 40 days and 40 nights. I don't think it's a coincidence that quarantine was 40 days and not 30 or 50 or something like that. The poor were moved to what's known as a lazaretto, and Lazarus, also biblical, was the leper, right, in the Bible. So a lazaretto was a place for lepers to go. But in this case, when there was an epidemic, they would send the poor to a leper colony. And we'll find out how they did that, like who did that later. They burned clothes because they believed it was infectious. And they did something called purging, and I'm not sure exactly what that was, but I assume it's some kind of disinfection of the people or their property, or things like that. So this is somewhat similar to what we're talking about with Ebola, is some of the things documented in this report were that manufacturers didn't want to produce products. Let's say you were producing food. You didn't want to produce food because it might be contaminated, and you might get the blame for spreading things. So they would not work, and the owners they had lots of money, so it didn't matter, but your workers now were on the brink of poverty. Hoarding of food during this time caused an increase in prices, which again harmed the poor. So we go on. So now I want to switch a little bit and start to talk about another disease, which we know is not infectious, called pellagra. Pellagra is another Italian word. That means, pelle agra means sour skin. And pellagra, as we know now, is a vitamin B deficiency, and it causes a lot of skin disorders. And skin disorders are also mentioned in this plague. And I'm not saying that the plague was pellagra, but as we'll see, the role of poverty and other factors in this time could have been important. So move on. So here are the symptoms of the Milan plague as mentioned in this book. There's no systematic summary. It's just, they didn't believe in like numerical tables in those days, so they would just casually mention that they found somebody with a bubo, sort of a bubonic plague, because that's how it's named. So the swelling of the lymph nodes, pimples and boils, and we go down to the last one, which I can't translate, Fibici. But there was only one mention of that. Can you go back? But you can see that a lot of these are skin disorders. And that makes sense, because that's how, in those days, without tools to look inside somebody, without x-rays and things like that, you really were looking at somebody's skin as a sign of health. And a lot of these are related to the skin. Okay, next. So this is pellagra, which I think is largely gone now, but was a serious problem in the beginning of the 20th century in America amongst poor people who had a diet that was heavily based on corn and caused horrible skin conditions. Next. And so there was a man, and then the National Institute of Health, interestingly enough, which is very big into infectious theories, proudly presents the story of Dr. Joseph Goldberger, who did some horrible experiments where he took blood from somebody with pellagra and he injected it into his assistant injected it into him, he dragged his wife in, they took skin, dried, horrible skin off the people with pellagra and they swallowed it. And what else did they do? There was one other thing. Oh yeah, they swabbed the nose, a mouth of somebody with pellagra, and they swabbed their nose and mouth with it, and nobody got sick. And so that was kind of a conclusive proof that pellagra was not infectious. Although many doctors refused to believe this evidence, and there were also doctors, as I say here. So for example, Harris in 1913 injected materials into monkeys. It doesn't say how, but it's quite likely into the brain of the monkey. And he was able to make the monkey sick, probably an experiment without controls. And so he said, pellagra is a virus. But I think the logical problem at that time was that they were looking for a cause. They were looking for a thing. So it could be a bacteria, it could be a virus, it could be a fungus, it could be something. But the cause of pellagra is not a thing. It's the absence of a thing. So pellagra is a vitamin B deficiency. So there's nothing going into the person that's harming the person. It's what's not going in that's harming them. And that logical step took centuries for people to say, if you don't have a complete diet, then you're going to get sick. But it's much easier to say, there's some invisible poison that some evil person painted on the wall, and that's why we're all getting sick. It's our evil enemies who are doing this, as opposed to saying, there was something wrong with the diet of people during this time. If we can go on. So let's look at the characters in this epidemic of the 1600s. Next. Okay, the Monati were very important. They were employees of the city, and their job was to drag people to the lazarettos. So if they thought you were sick, this is very much like the Ebola epidemic, where the West was accused of basically kidnapping people, saying, you've got Ebola, we're going to take you to Médecins Sans Frontières hospital or whatever. So the Monati were responsible for dragging you to the lazaretto, destroying your infected clothing, supervising the quarantine, and burying the dead. So all the nasty work. They took bribes, so if they showed up and you had money, you could pay them off and they'd leave you alone. But if you didn't have money, you'd get dragged off. And they didn't get sick. Was it because in this time of famine, in this time of poverty, the Monati had a job, they had money. They had the ability to, if they didn't get paid by the city, they could take your money. But they didn't get sick, which is kind of like tuberculosis doctors who treat tuberculosis patients and never get tuberculosis. The next. I mentioned the Untioni before. These are the evil people who painted this invisible substance on the walls. And in this report, it's quite obvious that the doctors believed in this. The people came into the city, and they did this evil thing to try to kill everybody in Milan. But if it's an invisible poison, how could you know? I mean, probably what happened is somebody said, that guy, I've never seen him before. He's evil, right? He comes from another city. And then the crowd sets on him and he gets ripped apart. The Italians had really creative ways to kill people that took a long time and were very agonizing. It was, pulling your limbs off your body and things like that. They invented another Italian word, defenestration, throwing somebody out of a window to kill them. That might be the last stage. But they didn't want to kill you too quickly because they wanted to torture you first. But if they caught an Untioni, if they caught somebody with this poison they couldn't see, then they had to be killed in a very brutal way. So the physicians wrote the report, and here they describe what wonderful people they were. Physicians Tedino, so he's talking about himself in the third person, Carcano and Sapali, they didn't rest day or night, united in their zeal for public health, giving and taking orders and provisions to eradicate their common enemy, the plague. Now, given that the plague lasted 4 years, it's not clear that they were terribly successful in this. And what could they do? They could burn clothing, they could purge people, whatever that was. They could move people to the lazaretto. They could order things around, but what tools did they really have in those days? If it had been a virus, what could they have done to stop this from going? Continue. So there were some hints in this report that there were environmental causes, potentially environmental causes for this plague. So there was a period of war for that's like 60 years. Italy was also under Spanish rule, and the Spanish seemed more interested about getting money and goods out of Italy than actually supporting the Italian people. It says here, so here it says that Di Gonzalo of Cordova ruled, so the Spanish were ruling in Milan. It says that some of the people in the city allowed the Guccioni, the Swiss soldiers, the Venetians, the Genovese, to take grain. So they were exporting grain at a time of famine. And this has actually been something that's occurred in poor countries around the world, even in the modern era, that there will be a famine occurring. At the same time, exports of grain are occurring because it's the economic system that causes the famine. Like, why was the state not supporting the poor people? Here's a description of the of the lazaretto. Putrid and fetid straw in many rooms. They were never cleaned. They were drinking dirty water. There were too many people in cramped rooms. There was a deadly heat. Like, they had some really bad weather at this time. They had cold winters and hot summers. And it caused a massacre among the poor. Of course, a virus caused all this. Not the weather, not the economic system, not the poverty. Continue. So here we have, I think you could say that some of the ideas of this author we would consider irrational and crazy by modern standards, and yet we would just assume without questioning that he's right that it's an infectious epidemic. There was not an environmental disaster. Even the fact that the Monati didn't get sick should be evidence. And they said, or at least in Manzoni's book, he said, the Monati were all immune. But he's applying a modern concept that wouldn't apply then, because how would you know that somebody was immune? How would you know it was one bacteria, not 10 or 20? Like, how would you know somebody was immune to something you couldn't see? There was no test to see if somebody had antibodies to it. So in this report, there was never a question about it being infectious. There's talk about contagion throughout the book, never a question about whether it was really a contagious epidemic or not. Next. So, we will now move on to a somewhat more recent epidemic, the 1950s epidemic in the United States called polio. And I based this significantly on this book, which is the 1954 evaluation of the field trial of the polio vaccine. And many people, even the skeptics about HIV, will accept that polio was an infectious epidemic, and it's clear that the vaccine eliminated the epidemic. So let's see what we can find. This photo is interesting because it's actually my ex-mother-in-law on the left, doing one of the first polio epidemics. May her soul rest in heaven or wherever she went.
Would you like to elaborate on your divorce?
No, I mean, yes. No, I don't. No. But I just thought it was a good picture of, obviously it's a staged photo just by the way people are standing there. But the date is important because it's 1955, and this is the 1954 field trial. So this is an early injection in Canada. Canada participated in this field trial along with the United States. Next. So this graph is very interesting, I think. So this is a polio graph in the United States, and this is the rate of polio, so it's adjusted for the changing population. It's the rate per 100,000. So here's some important dates. So this early 1900s is when Landsteiner and Popper claimed proof that polio was caused by a virus. This is years before the electron microscope existed. So what they claimed as proof would not be considered proof today, I don't think. There was obviously a big epidemic around here, a huge epidemic compared to any of the other years. And then there was another epidemic in 1952, which is over here. The vaccination started here. No, pardon me. So this was the epidemic. This was the field trial. This was the start of commercial vaccination or widespread vaccination. And here, this is interesting. At that point, 1960, somebody wrote an article in the Journal of the American Medical Association complaining that less than 50% of the vulnerable population in the United States have been vaccinated. So we cannot use herd immunity to explain this destruction, this diminishment of the epidemic. What you can see just off this graph is that by the time vaccination started in 1955, the epidemic had just about reduced in half. And it obviously didn't, the vaccination program didn't go very fast. If by 1960 they still had vaccinated less than half of the vulnerable population, there's something else driving the drop in this epidemic. Next. So one of the most stunning things about polio, which most people don't know, is that polio had a season. And we're not talking about, flu has a season. There's more flu cases in the winter than the summer. But, it's not like this. It's kind of like this kind of a curve. But let's look at the curves for polio. Next. So this is actually in this report. So they looked at 3 years of polio cases, and what you see is August, September are the peak, and then July, October, June, and November. So there's a clear symmetrical curve occurring. Now, what's special about August, September? It's not the growing season. The growing season starts back here. What is it about the later part of the year that could be related to an environmental cause? It's the harvest season, and it's particularly the fruit harvest season, if we can go on to the next slide. Okay, so this, I'll have to explain this graph a little bit, it's very clever. So basically it's showing the apple growing season in black. So this is the apple growing season in one country. And then the hatched is the polio season. So here you see, this is probably the same country. So you see the polio season is a portion of the apple season, but it's quite closely related. And then the white is the entire, so there's apple growing season, the polio season, and then the entire growing season. And this is the southern hemisphere countries, so like Australia and New Zealand. And this is the northern hemisphere. So this is summer in the southern hemisphere, and this is summer in the northern hemisphere. So what this graph is really saying, and I don't have the list of the countries, but they're all over the place. France, Germany, Italy, the United States, Canada, whatever. What you can see is there's a close correlation between the fruit harvest season in many countries around the world and polio. If we go to the next. So this was a paper from 1946, and there are actually 3 graphs like this, and this is California, which has the biggest population, but he also had graphs from New York and Utah, which are virtually identical. So he superimposed the fruit harvest season on the polio season. So here's the polio season, this huge peak. And when in biology do you ever see a peak this dramatic? Like if you were to look, as I said, at influenza, you would see a peak more like this. It's there, you can see it, it's clear, but nothing anywhere close to this dramatic. So we have strawberries, cherries, peaches, apricots. This is the end of the cherry season, apples, etc. So this is 1946, he superimposed the fruit harvest season on the polio epidemic and showing that that was highly correlated with the polio season. But why? So some other things about polio that are a bit strange are that it is supposedly infectious, and you would think that you'd have multiple cases in families quite often. Somebody gets down, a few weeks later, there's an incubation period, a week or 2 later, other people come down with polio. So here, most of the multiple cases in families, which were actually quite rare, it was very rare to actually have multiple cases, they developed at the same time. So if it's an infectious cause, it would be one after the other. So maybe one person gets sick, and then 2 weeks later, the rest of the family gets sick. That's the infectious theory. If they all get sick at the same time, it's probably an environmental cause. There was an epidemic in an Amish community, and they pointed out this community only had 200 people. It's a very tight community, so they implied that there was, contact between the 5 children who tested positive for polio. I don't think they had any disease. But Amish people do use pesticides. Although they live a very simple life, they use fertilizers and pesticides. So that is, contamination from pesticides is a possibility. There was quite a bit of investigation into a 1940s Utah epidemic. And some of these people lived in such isolated circumstances. In one case, there was a family of a mother and a father and a child who lived 75 miles in a sheep camp from the closest town. And yet, the child came down with polio. Here's another quote. Polio in the mid-20th century typically struck one person in a family at a time. And this is also true with the mad cow disease. Like the first cases of mad cow disease occurred in multiple animals on the same farm. So prions for mad cows are supposed to be very specific to the cow. Therefore, you could have all the cows dying, and the chickens and the pigs and everything else would be quite happy. But here you've got a case, chickens with paralysis. A dog with paralysis. So either polio is promiscuous in the animals that it can affect, or we're talking about an environmental poison. Next. So let's move on to the 1954 field trial of polio, and let's look at the proof that this actually prevented the development of paralytic polio. So it was written by Thomas Francis, who was a big name back in the 1950s. So there's no question this was the best of the best, at least according to virologists. Polio was a huge panic. If there was a rumor of polio, people would not let their children go to the swimming pool. They would pull them out of school. It was kind of like AIDS in terms of the panic. It was focused mostly on children, because it was children who were becoming paralyzed for the most part. But the panic aspect was very similar. So that means that if you're in charge of the vaccine trial, basically failure is not an option. You have to succeed. So there were 2 sections of the trial. There was the observed. So what they did there is they vaccinated grade 2 students, and they used the grade 1 and 3 students as a comparison. This is considered a very poor experimental design, so we won't talk about that too much. But they did have a placebo arm, so 200,000 grade 1, 2, 3 students were vaccinated versus almost the same number who received the placebo versus a larger number who were not vaccinated. I mean, this is already a problem because if you have, so you have 700,000 people, and if close to half didn't get vaccinated, you have to ask a question. You have to ask the question, were those people different than those who accepted to be either vaccinated or placebo? Because presumably the people who received the vaccine or the placebo didn't know. There was a very large number of people who refused to participate. And those people may have been poorer, they might have been richer, they might have been healthier, they might have been sicker. So that already diminishes the power of the study. So next. So there's one table in this book. Okay, I really shouldn't have carried the whole book all this distance. It's quite heavy. This one table summarizes everything you need to know about the study, and this was the big victory. So let's talk about what was not a victory. So, placebo areas, observed areas. So we're just going to talk about placebo. As I said, the observed is not really a good experimental design, so we can ignore that. Let's talk about non-paralytic polio. You've probably never heard of that. But back in the 1950s, it was accepted that there were 3 types of polio. There's paralytic, which we all understand. Non-paralytic, which is basically stomach upset, fevers, things like that. The kinds of symptoms that you now find with Ebola or SARS or just about anything. And then there was abortive polio, which was no symptoms at all. So somebody who has a positive polio test, but has no symptoms. And that was sometimes useful because you could infer abortive cases to try to build an argument that there actually was infection occurring. But here's the success. Vaccinated rate of paralytic polio 16. Placebo 55. So that's, okay, it's a slam dunk. We can go home now. Polio vaccine works. But oh, wait a minute. There were the not inoculated. And they had a rate of 36. So the not inoculated people had nothing done to them. They were not inoculated with a vaccine. And they had a rate much lower than those who received the placebo. So we kind of have a couple of things we can use to explain this. One is that the placebo causes polio. It's hard to believe this because I believe they never tell you what's really in the placebo, but I believe that the placebo was the polio vaccine less the biological component. So how could that cause paralysis? If it caused paralysis, the same compounds are in the vaccine along with the biological component. So maybe there was some bias when you're recording cases. We have 682 paralytic polio cases were reported amongst members of the study out of almost 2 million study patients. So how would we know when a child shows up at the hospital with paralysis whether they were vaccinated, placebo, or not vaccinated? How would we know that? So in the United States, they have the SSN, the Social Security number. And between 1947 and 1962, 6% were given to those under 15. So basically, the children in the polio study had no unique ID. You would have the name, what class they were in, things like that. However, you have children that move from school to school, who can't remember the name of their teacher. The children were given a piece of paper that says, you were vaccinated, or you were given this injection, which was either vaccine or placebo. How many parents would keep that piece of paper? So you have John Smith, who has paralysis, and he says, where were you in March of 1954 when you were injected? It's like, well, we moved from this school to that school, and I'm not sure which class I was in, and I don't remember the name of my teacher. Or maybe the mother got remarried and his name changed, or things like that. Maybe there was a misspelling, or maybe somebody put the vaccine and placebo on the wrong line. So what if there was a little bit of bias, where you might say, well, we have this paralysis case, and we're not sure, but my educated guess is that it was placebo. Right? What if it was a little bit of bias? Let's go to the next slide. So, let's see here. We have the rate of 16 amongst vaccinated, 36 among not inoculated, 55 amongst the placebo. So what if that difference represents cases that were incorrectly assigned to the placebo, but they were actually not placebo cases because of this difficulty of assigning people? So that would mean out of the 110 placebo cases of paralytic polio, that 72 cases would result in a rate of 36, which would leave 38 misassigned cases. Just 38 cases, which change the placebo down to the level of not inoculated. But where would those cases have come from? They would have had to come from the vaccinated. So if we add the 38 to the vaccinated, we end up with a rate of 35. So by shuffling 38 cases of paralytic polio to the vaccinated case, so that we align the rate in placebo and the rate of not inoculated, we end up with the same rate effectively in all three categories. Which would be to say, by shuffling around 38 cases, we would completely erase the benefit of this vaccine trial. And you've got to imagine there's 2 million people in this trial, pre-computer age. They had a huge data center with, if they had 2 million people, they probably had 10 million pieces of paper. And then you get a report coming in, and out of that 10 million pieces of paper, you have to find what classroom they were in, what line number they were in on the form that was filled out by the teacher, which vial number it was. And what if you got a piece of paper and the vial number was never written down? What are you going to do then, right? It would be a temptation. It would be a bias. It would be a temptation to be biased, even unconsciously, because you really want to do what you were told to do, which is to finish this trial. So, going on to talk about, has polio disappeared? And according to the World Health Organization, I can make two statements. Polio has disappeared, polio is increasing dramatically. Let's look at the graph. I guess you first have to talk about this. So acute flaccid paralysis is polio symptoms without the virus. There's no difference between acute flaccid paralysis and polio, except that the virus cannot be detected. World Health Organization, despite a dramatic reduction in the number of AFP cases from poliovirus, so they're actually saying that polio is AFP, because they're saying AFP with the poliovirus, that's polio, AFP without. So AFP continues to be a major problem worldwide, but not so much of it is related to the virus. And what are the causes of acute flaccid paralysis? Polio and other viruses, of course, the vaccine adverse reactions, snake bite, insecticides. Now, one of the things, I wanted to include some work from a guy named Jim West in New York City who got me started on this whole polio thing. After World War II, there was a huge surge in use of organochlorine pesticides. During World War II, DDT was a state secret, which was used on military bases to, in the tropics to get rid of mosquitoes, and it was considered a miracle. After World War II, you could buy paint and underwear with DDT in it because it was considered so non-toxic. So there was a huge surge in use of the DDT before people started to have second thoughts about this. So Jim West's theory is that the polio epidemic was actually caused by the careless use of DDT, which was dramatically overused after World War II. Anyway, let's continue. So here's the graph. So the lower graph is poliovirus cases, which we can clearly see is pretty damn close to zero. And they complain because there are some places where it's unsafe for polio vaccine workers to work, and therefore there are a few cases every year. But here's the acute flaccid paralysis. So it hit 100,000 cases around 2010. They only started monitoring this in 1996. And it's not very easy to find the statistics. And in fact, the World Health Organization has deleted many of the statistics from their website. They only have like the last 5 years, but I've kept track of what the statistics are. So you actually can't go to the World Health Organization and get the entire graph. You can only get the last few years. But why has there been this dramatic increase in polio symptoms and acute flaccid paralysis over the last years? I read a paper, I think it was from El Salvador, where this girl came into the hospital with paralysis, sudden onset paralysis. And for some reason, crazy doctor, he didn't blame a virus or a bacteria or something like that. He discovered that this girl had her shampoo in a used pesticide bottle. And so he had all her hair cut off, and he gave her an antidote to the organophosphate, and she recovered from the paralysis. What if he'd been a normal doctor and said, oh, I think this is polio, or this is one of the other 1,000 viruses that cause paralysis? She would have remained paralyzed. And it would have reinforced the theory that these horrible infectious diseases come along and just paralyze people out of nowhere. But for some reason, he thought out of the box and realized what was going on. And you may have heard about the careless use of pesticides in the third world. It's not very hard to find information. I was reading some papers in Latin America about workers who will spray the crops with pesticides in the morning. You're supposed to go have a shower afterwards. But they're poor farmers, and they work in the fields all afternoon, and then they have a shower at night. That's the way it is. If you have a shower in the day, you don't get paid as much. So the financial incentive is go work all day with pesticides all over your body. And not surprisingly, there's a lot of pesticide issues, but I think there's also diseases that are considered to be infectious that are disguising some of the damage caused by pesticides. Next. So let's summarize what I've found with polio. The seasonality pretty much says it's environmental. It's hard to see how a disease would start in June, July, August if it was environmentals. Some people have said, well, polio is carried in fecal matter, so children go to the toilet in the winter and it's frozen and they don't have the bacteria, but in the summer they carry the bacteria. But if that was the case, polio season would start in like March or April or whenever it starts to get warm, not later in the summer.
They used to say you get it in a swimming pool.
Yes, so that's why parents wouldn't take their kids swimming.
When I was a kid, that was widespread belief.
Yes, because it would probably be, child gets in the swimming pool, hasn't wiped himself properly, there's fecal matter in the pool, other children get it, so that was like the rumor of how it was covered. So the correlation with the fruit harvest season strongly suggests pesticides. And just as a point of information, before World War II, almost all fruit pesticides were based on arsenic. There was something called Paris green, which was very commonly used. Some pesticides also had lead in them. They were very effective nerve poisons. And in the Utah case, where they were studying these children who were, in the middle of nowhere, who came down with polio, in both cases, the common denominator was that the child had eaten unwashed fruit. And it was actually stated in these papers. And in other cases, it was like people gorged on strawberries, and then a bunch of them got sick. And so were these just not properly washed to remove the pesticides? And something else I said about polio, Western privilege. We care about diseases in the rest of the world, or anywhere, if we think they can affect us. So 100,000 acute flaccid paralysis cases, which are believed to be non-infectious, are 100,000 children paralyzed who cannot harm us. But 20 polio cases could, because they're believed to be infectious. And I would just like to ask the World Health Organization, why are you so focused on the rapidly diminishing number of polio virus cases when the number of paralytic cases is increasing? And you seem to have no interest in finding out what's really behind it. You have they have a paper with a laundry list of potential causes, but there's no attempt to actually analyze it, because I think they think, well, it's probably not infectious, therefore we in the West just don't care. And in fact, they've even said that the greater number of acute flaccid paralysis cases is a good thing. And the reason they've made this strange statement is because they believe that the rate of acute flaccid paralysis has been constant over time. And the reason why the graph has gone up is because they're getting better and better at finding these cases. And so if you can accept that actually that graph that I showed you is not 100,000, dropping to like 20,000 in 1996, but it was always 100,000, then what that means is they're finding more and more of these cases, and so the actual rate of poliovirus should have been much higher in 1996, and it's actually dropped more dramatically. So they can pat themselves on the back. I hope I've lost you with this math. They can pat themselves on the back and say, our combat against the poliovirus is even more successful than we thought. And still not caring about the AFP. And so my conclusion, and I came into this reluctantly after Jim West bugged me about it, is that polio is almost certainly not viral, at least not the majority of cases of polio. And I think there's a lot more to this story than that, but I think that gives you a flavor. Next. I think that's it.
That's it. Thank you, David.
Yes.